Alright guys, Murphs here, and today I want to talk about this. A Heritage Manufacturing Rough Rider, chambered in 22 long rifle and 22 magnum. This is the latest in the Friendly Fire series, the series where I review guns out of my friends' collections in order to remove my purchase bias, as well as discuss whether or not I would buy it and what changes I would make. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get into a little bit of background, because this is not a terribly historic firearm. In 1992, Heritage Manufacturing started producing 22 long rifle revolvers in a kind of cowboy Colt Peacemaker format. And since then have massively diversified their product line, still catering primarily to 22 revolvers, even a carbine version, a revolving carbine, as well as some importations of cowboy-style firearms out of Italy. And we'll talk about that in a later video, which is going to be a bit of a teaser. But for the moment, there's not a whole lot else to cover about these relatively or extremely inexpensive 22 revolvers, other than to say that Heritage Manufacturing was picked up by Taurus in 2014. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get into features of this particular handgun. Right off the bat, we have a 4 3/4 inch barrel. These handguns are produced in barrel lengths from as low as 3 inches and as long as 16 inches, which just seems ridiculous to me, but to each their own. On top of the barrel, we have a blade type front sight, which I like to refer to as a shark fin front sight, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who does, or at least I'm the only one who I've ever heard do it. Underneath the barrel, we have a spring-loaded ejector rod, pretty typical for your cowboy action type pistols. Something to point out, guys, that you have to keep an eye on these. You have this little screw right here to hold this to the barrel, and sometimes it comes a little loose. This one's come loose again, so I'm going to tighten that up before I give it back to the owner. Now, here, back up against the frame, we have our plunger that releases our central axis pin in order to be able to remove the cylinder. We'll talk about that more here in a bit. Coming to our frame. Now, this handgun is pretty much or almost exclusively made out of alloys, be it either zinc or aluminum alloys, which is one of the things that really makes this an incredibly inexpensive firearm, in addition to being a 22, which is not to say that you can't find expensive 22s, as much as to say that if you find a really inexpensive firearm, it's probably a 22. Now, our rear sight is this gutter type rear sight here, which we'll talk about this sight picture here more once we get to the shooting portion. Our cylinder is a 6-shot cylinder. They do produce 9-shot cylinders, and this one happens to be reversible. You can switch this out from a 22 long rifle to a 22 magnum. I only shot this pistol as a 22 long rifle. I didn't have any real interest in messing around with 22 magnum. Now, we do have a side loading gate, which is also pretty typical on cowboy style guns. One of the things that I found interesting about this, I've never really noticed this with other cowboy style guns that I've shot in the past, but it seems like it's very easy to accidentally close this gate whenever I was going through the loading process, which is neither here nor there. It's not that big of a deal. It's just something that I noticed and might be a source of irritation for you if you were a purchaser of this firearm. Now, in order to be able to rotate the cylinder, you do have to place the weapon into the half-cock position, which then allows you to rotate through your chambers with an audible click every time you turn it. And that is also part of your unloading procedure as well. Now, this revolver does not come with a transfer bar safety, which is pretty typical on modern produced revolvers. So with that being the case, there is a warning on the gun that states do not have a live round underneath the hammer, and that being because the hammer is pressed up against the firing pin right now. If you were to drop this, strike this hammer real hard or something along those lines, it could cause the round to go off, and that's definitely unsafe. However, the handgun is also produced with a safety right there that performs the action or performs the function of the transfer bars. We can see now the hammer is back just a little bit, and if I turn the safety off, it is now all the way forward, resting against the firing pin. So, of course, Heritage Manufacturing has done their part. They have warned you not to put a round underneath the hammer, so that way, if for some reason their safety fails and the gun goes off, it's not their fault. But I have pressed on this quite a bit. It's not like I've necessarily taken a hammer to it or anything like that. This isn't my gun. I'm not trying to break it. But I don't see why it would be an issue to keep a round underneath the hammer. But to each their own on that one. Some people get really bent around the axle about the idea of possibly not doing a cowboy load on their cowboy action handgun. Hello, Brad. Hi. Yeah, the dog came by to say hello again. This seems to be her new trend. All right, so our trigger is, of course, a single action trigger. This is a cowboy gun. And overall, I've got to say that it's pretty uninteresting as far as triggers are concerned. It's not super light, but there's not a lot of take up, there's not a lot of staging or anything like that. It's pretty much ready to go. It's just kind of heavy. So there's not really a lot of like nitpicky type stuff I can get into on this particular trigger. And at this price point, I'm not really interested in getting into the nitty gritty on this trigger, if I'm being completely honest. Our grips, these are a kind of red Cocobolo grip. You can find these in a wide variety of grip shapes. You can get them in, well, you can get them like this or bird's head, as well as grip finishes, as well as receiver finishes. You can get these in red, you can get them in American flag patterns and all that kind of stuff. And that's not really my thing. I kind of like simple, kind of classic, solid tones and all that kind of stuff, but to each their own on that particular aspect. As far as the grip shape is concerned, single action cowboy style revolvers have a very ergonomic shape to them. They point very naturally. And the contour of the grip is comfortable, though I do think it's a tad thin for my hand. I have a tendency to have this move around in my grip a little bit whenever it is that I'm going through the shooting process. But that's also to kind of be expected with stock cowboy style grips. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers the features of this particular handgun. How does it shoot?
And then there's a safety on the side. The thumb safety is like a 1911. And there's nothing small. That is nice. What? You can get one. They make one.
Well, to put it simply, it shoots like a .22 revolver, which is to say that recoil's super light and it's a lot of fun to shoot this particular handgun. But let's go ahead and dive a little bit deeper than that. What about the sights? Well, though the handgun does point very naturally, the sights are not very easy to pick up. So they don't really stand out. There's not a lot of contrast in them or anything like that. You have black on black. It's a very small trough that you have here for a rear sight. The front sight pretty much takes up that entire trough, which is good, but it can make it a little bit difficult to take a very fine bead on a particular target. And I especially found this when I was shooting this handgun out to 75 yards at a 4-inch steel target. I was just not connecting with it that particular day, which I don't think that speaks anything necessarily inherently about the accuracy of this handgun. I'm sure it can be done. Maybe it was somebody with a little bit smaller hand who it better suits and all that kind of stuff. But for me, it was very difficult. I had other handguns out there that day that I was hitting that steel with quite consistently. So I don't necessarily think it was myself as the shooter that was the issue, as much as myself in conjunction with this handgun that was the issue. Now, for closer range targets and all that kind of stuff, I've had no trouble shooting this handgun. It is actually, I most recently here used it as a tool to really bear down on both eyes open shooting, because I do have a tendency, if I feel a little like I'm trying to do precision shooting or something like that, like I have to close one eye, and that's something that I've been challenging myself to change, which is going against, you know, years of personal practice. And I'm trying very hard to rewrite that for myself, which is one of the unfortunate things about having a history of a shooter. As you grow and develop, sometimes it can be very difficult to change old habits. Now, reliability-wise, you would expect me to say that this handgun was 100% reliable because it is a revolver. However, any mechanical system can break down, and I did wind up running into an issue with this handgun twice in a row, where I would go to unload it and the cylinder would freeze, and then I wouldn't be able to move the hammer or the trigger. So I'd wind up having to remove the central pin, knock out the cylinder, and then drop the hammer so that I could put it back in the half-cock position, reinstall the cylinder, and then it would turn freely. And what I think that came down to was not seating the cartridges all the way into the chamber, which, if you do that, you wind up causing a little bit of additional tension that could gum up the cylinder and not allow it to turn properly. Now, why did I not notice that up until I tried to unload it? I'm not entirely certain. It could have, any number of things could have occurred to cause it to be an issue in that particular circumstance. But once I was more mindful, first I was like, what even caused this? And then having it happen twice in a row was even more concerning. But I didn't have it happen again after that, and that was with making sure that I was being very forceful in how I loaded it, making sure that I got that cartridge rim all the way up against the cylinder. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations? Would I recommend this as a duty type firearm? Absolutely not. Not in a million years. Not just because it's a 22, but also because it's a single action, and this is just not a viable option for duty type use, police, contractor, security, whatever it is that it may be. These are obsolete as far as duty type use is concerned. Okay, what about self-defense or concealed carry? Again, no. And this time, in part because it is a 22 long rifle, but also because it's a single action handgun. Now, I don't personally subscribe to the theory that your safeties should be derived from the trigger. I personally feel that once you come onto the trigger, that is your decision that you are making to shoot. However, I changed my mind a little bit on that when it comes to single action triggers on revolvers, because they have a tendency to be very light. And as you're trying to line up your shot, you may discharge that round a touch sooner than you initially intended. I've seen it happen a ton of times out on the range. I've had it happen sometimes out on the range. It just, especially if you come off of shooting a semi-auto and you switch over to this, you could absolutely throw an errant round. And in the self-defense type situation, that could have you going from justified shoot to homicide investigation. I don't think that's necessarily something that most people want to deal with. So I would not recommend a single action handgun in general for self-defense type use, and I would not recommend a 22 for any able-bodied person who's capable of handling a more potent cartridge. Now, if you're talking about somebody who doesn't have the hand strength and all that kind of stuff, I still wouldn't recommend this. There are a ton of other options out of the market that I would recommend much sooner than this particular handgun or anything of its variety. Okay, so not for home defense, self-defense. What about as a hunting gun? Well, if this is in a legal configuration for hunting in your area, then absolutely, this would be fantastic to shoot at some squirrels or some rabbits or something along those lines. Now, this would also be a really great companion if you were trapping and you wanted to make sure that you were putting out of its misery whatever was in your trap. This would be a fantastic option for that. Inexpensive and perfectly capable of performing that very simple function. So a woods gun in general, if you were just going to go out onto your property, farm, whatever, perhaps something for a farmhand or something along those lines to be able to dispatch vermin and varmints and stuff like that, if you ran across them, this would be a fantastic choice. What about a competition gun? Well, if I remember correctly, there is a 22 long rifle division in cowboy action shooting. So this would be a pretty fantastic option for that. Especially for young kids or something along that line that you're wanting to get interested in competitive style shooting. This would do a great job of getting them into it at low cost in both firearm and ammunition. As well as it would be really great confidence building. All right, guys. Those are my recommendations. Would I buy this? Well, in this case, guys, this is actually kind of unfair because normally we would be removing my purchase bias, but I have one of these handguns. This is my Heritage Rough Rider in a 9-inch barrel, chambered in 22 LR with the 22 Magnum cylinder as well, which actually this has the 22 Magnum cylinder in it right now. So the easy answer is yes, I would absolutely buy a Heritage Rough Rider revolver. No questions asked. But if we dig into it a little bit deeper, would I buy one in a 4 3/4 inch barrel? And the answer is absolutely. Sometimes this 9-inch barrel is just more than what I actually want to lug around. Like, it's a lot of fun to shoot, and it most definitely does not move under recoil. Like, this gun doesn't necessarily move around that much under recoil to begin with, but this 9-inch barrel just stays still. Your sights hardly move and all that kind of stuff. And while that's very fun and all that kind of stuff, I don't feel like the 9-inch barrel does anything else for accuracy. Like, yes, it gives me longer sight radius, and it gives me substantially longer sight radius than what I have on this, but it doesn't give me any finer of a sight. I still have this very shallow notch, and I still have no real contrast between my front and rear sight, so I don't feel like the sight radius really does that much for me. When it comes to velocity, yes, this is a longer barrel and I have theoretically more velocity, but at the end of the day, I'm still working with a 22 long rifle, so I'm still restricted by its capabilities no matter what, which 22 long rifle is not so significant that 4 1/4 inches more barrel are going to take this from a plinker to a serious use firearm. And honestly, guys, at the end of the day, that's what it gets down to this. What would these handguns be to me? What is this to me, and what would this be to me? Well, I can tell you that for the owner, this was what he used to introduce his kids to handgun shooting. Now, there's a couple things you got to take into account whenever it is that you make that recommendation, and that is that you do have this single action trigger, which potentially could be very detrimental to the safety of a new shooter. However, with having to cock the hammer and then pull the trigger and all that kind of stuff, you can go ahead and isolate the different functions of firearm shooting, specifically handgun shooting, and make it very easy to teach them the right way. Especially having a manual safety, you can put that safety on, so even if they mishandle it in some way, they're not going to accidentally discharge the firearm and potentially hurt themselves or others, and then flip that safety off before they fire their round. There's a lot of good attributes to a single action firearm, specifically a 22, to teaching young kids or new shooters in general. This is not a very threatening handgun. 22 long rifles, a light recoiling cartridge, and all that kind of stuff. This gives them the opportunity to get very comfortable with the process of shooting and safe firearms handling before you take them to something that's maybe a little bit more complicated, maybe a little bit more major caliber or something like that. They're actually going to have to contend with recoil. They're going to have to contend with slide cycling and all that kind of stuff, and really get into the minutia of shooting, where this gives them a very good introduction to it, a nice easy handoff that they can handle fairly easily. So with that, absolutely, I would buy this handgun in a heartbeat. These are fantastic guns, and if I didn't already have one, then this would totally be on my list of possible handguns to purchase. Now, what would I get for this handgun? Honestly, not a lot. Pretty much just a holster. Something that I would be comfortable taking out in the woods and all that kind of stuff, and having this available to me to be able to take some pot shots at stumps or you know, take out whatever varmint or something like that, that if I had a garden or something like that, had gotten in my garden, whatever it is that it may be, you know, all that being situationally dependent based on where you're at and what you're doing. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.
I have one for hunting. I love this guy. One of the front pockets over there. This is probably my most accurate pistol.